So I just maybe mention that we are going to record the session as we are recording all other sessions. And I'm Sutapa. And so it's myself and Alberto who are facilitating this session. And I will start facilitating it, and Alberto can join whenever he wants to. So we are in session 4 now. And the theme or the topic of the session is classical and contemporary modes of analysis. We have one co-authored presentation and 5, so there are 5 topics that are going to be presented by the authors. I'll just maybe quickly mention the names. And then why don't we do a very quick round of introducing yourselves, and then we can follow the order at which the names are mentioned here. So, and pardon me if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name. We first have Tiago Carvalho, Arnab Roy Chowdhury, Aurora Perego and Stefania Vicari, Clare Saunders, and Katrin Uba. And I'll stop. And I'll have you maybe do a quick round of introducing yourselves, and then we can start with Tiago. Is Tiago here? Or if he joined?
I don't see him yet, Sutapa.
No. So should we start with Arnab maybe, if you are okay? Yeah? Okay, great.
Thank you, Professor Sutapa. I'm Arnab Roy Chowdhury. I'm teaching in the Higher School of Economics, Moscow, in the Department of Sociology. Currently, I'm an associate professor, and I work in the field of social movements generally, but various kinds, mostly natural resources movement against, natural resource extractions and various other themes and political ecology. So this is my area of research. I also work on refugees, issues of refugee in South Asia. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me here.
Should we go to Aurora, Perego, and Stefania? I think Stefania joined. I saw Stefania.
Yes, thank you, Sutapa. Yes, I'm here. Aurora is coming. She's currently teaching and running from one room to another to join, but she will be here. So I'm Stefania Vicari, and I'm based at the Department of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield. I work on participation more broadly. So social movements were more a thing in my past research, and now I've expanded towards studying discourses and visual content in the context of different forms of participation, especially in digital spaces, social media primarily. And our chapter is about frame analysis. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Claire, I think Claire is here as well. Yeah, there.
Hi, nice to meet everybody online. And yeah, so my name's Claire. I'm a professor in environmental politics in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences on the Cornwall campus of the University of Exeter, which is the southwest peninsula of the UK, hidden in deep, beautiful Cornwall. And my research is on social change organisations, social change makers, mostly in the context of the environmental cause. So it's nice to be here, and I'm going to be talking, particularly later, I'll be talking about protest surveys. Thank you.
And then we have Katrin Uba. Thank you, Claire.
Hello, nice to see everyone. And yes, I'm Katrin Uba. I'm associate professor in political science at Uppsala University, Sweden, and doing my research on social movement outcomes mostly, currently focusing on environmental movements, but I've done also other labor and school-related mobilization. And today I will talk about the methods for studying social movement outcomes.
As we are waiting for Tiago, thank you, Katrin. As we are waiting for Tiago, I see Aurora joined in. Aurora, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Aurora. I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Trento in Italy. I'm mostly interested in social movement alliances and coalitions, but looking at them from a gender and intersectional perspective. And today I'm going to talk about frame analysis together with Stefania.
Yeah. So what should we do? Should we start with Arnab? When Tiago maybe joins, we can, or maybe what we can do is like we can start with Arnab and we can follow the order and then have Tiago go in the end. I hope they will be okay with that. So that way we kind of stay on time and everybody has their time to do their chapters, and then like we have enough time for Q&A as well. So if Arnab is okay, we can start with you. Yeah? Okay.
Sure. I think it's about, it's a brief presentation, right? I believe it's about a 10 minutes introduction to the chapter, and we can later discuss the main contents, etc. So my chapter is, as you know, it's Repertoires of Contention, examining concept, method, context, and practice. So before going, what I have covered in this chapter, I will kind of give a small prologue, how I got involved in this research. That was my first involvement, how it started. Because in this particular chapter, actually, the experience of field work and conceptualization that I have done, it comes from my first exposure to this movement in the year 2006. So in 2006, I was doing my MPhil degree in India in sociology, and I got this small fellowship from Speak Mackay organization. It's called Guru Shishya Tradition Fellowship, which basically means that you get a fellowship under particular guru, a teacher who will make you learn various aspects of what they do. So they had a long list of names, and because I was doing sociology, I had particular interest in social movement at the time, and I saw the name of Medha Patkar, who is basically the leader of the Save Narmada movement, quite famous throughout the world now. Anyway, so I chose her as my guru, and then I traveled to Narmada Valley in India, where I stayed for a few months to get some kind of training from her of activism. But at the same time, I decided that I will do a bit of field work there, and I should write my MPhil thesis out of that. So that's my kind of first exposure to the field. So for this chapter that I wrote, I mostly present the data that I collected and narrate the way that I collected it in 2006. So for the paper and this presentation today, I have taken the data from notes that I wrote in my field diary during that time in 2006, travelogues that I wrote, and live journals that I maintained during those days. So the methods that I used then was partly field work, ethnographic observation, in-depth interviews, and a bit of secondary literature review. Now, long after this, it was in 2006. So long after this, when I was doing my PhD between 2009 to 2014, so I went back to Narmada Valley, because Narmada Bachao Andolan and Narmada movements that are organized there, that played a significant role for my PhD as well, because in my PhD, I did a comparative study of two anti-dam movements in India, and Narmada was one. So I went back to the field in Narmada Valley again in 2012 and later. But by then, my research focus had shifted slightly more towards comparative and historical analysis of anti-dam movements. And the focus of my methods also changed. So for this particular chapter, for today's presentation, I'm actually going to talk a bit about my 2006 field work and how I conceptualized from that about repertoires of contentions, and eventually also wrote my MPhil thesis out of that. So research on social movements, of course, demands involvement in a field which is abuzz with contentious activities, sometimes against the powerful, such as the politicians, the police, the government, and corporations. But how do we conduct field work in such a politically charged and conflicted environment, such as social movements, mobilizations, or protests? So in some way, in this chapter, I talk about that. So this chapter is a sort of mini manual, and it provides a kind of pragmatic suggestion. It explains what it means in methodological and practical terms to understand and research a particular dimension of contentious politics. which is known as repertoires of contention. All of us know about that. Or repertoires of collective action. So repertoires of collective action can be briefly defined as a whole set of means that a group has for making claims of different types on different individuals, such as through logistically organized collective social actions and raising demands. Now, what is then contentious politics and repertoires of contention? So every society has forms of political contention or contestation or habitual ways of interaction. Now, these interactions include activities, many kinds of activities, of course. I cannot have a master list of that, but it includes pamphleteering, petition drives, statements in public media, meetings, sit-ins, marches, vigils, rallies, demonstrations, solemn processes and public meetings, boycotting, riots, strikes, coalitions, all performed in the process of collective action. Now, generally, these are the things that we kind of list when we are talking about repertoires of contention. Now, these stocks of forms used are they constitute the use of a set of tools, strategies, techniques, and modalities of contestation in protest activities within a specific spatiotemporal, discursive, historical, and institutional context. Now, they have various typologies, of course. I'm not going to cover them here. But to give example of these activities, I took the case of NBA and my fieldwork that I did in 2006. So I used my research into the Save Narmada movement as an example, which is a movement against large hydropower project in India that emerged in 1980s and still continues on a diminished scale, of course, and that has inspired movements worldwide. So the movements of the Atingidos, or the displaced persons in Brazil, are partly inspired by Narmada Bachao Andolan, and there are various other countries where movements are inspired by NBA. Now, studying repertoires of contention lets us observe, analyze, and understand the many legacies, the characteristics, aspects, and layers of a social movement. Now, this chapter that I wrote concerns itself with the methods and methodological aspects of researching repertoires of contention. Here I provide examples from my fieldwork and research into Save Narmada movement because it has used a wide range of repertoires of various kinds and meanings, both old with rich legacy, old repertoires with rich legacy, and innovative ones that are real-time, and as well as online repertoires. Now, in terms of methodologies, these repertoires used by NBA range in visibility from mundane ones to the spectacular ones. I have tried to analyze the dimension of repertoires in terms of methodologies and operational terms as well. I have also stated how I collected data from primary and secondary sources using a variety of qualitative methodologies and techniques. I have touched upon the kinds of questions of ethics and pragmatic decision making that may arise in the field due to the kinds of problems we might face in a particular context, such as issues of safety and security of the participants, of the field workers like me, and observes and ourselves in contentious and potentially dangerous environments. So although much of the discussion is contextual, in this chapter, it's like a method essay or a primer for practical use, primarily by students beginning their research into social movements. So for example, I have in this paper, I have listed various kinds of repertoires that Narmada Bachao Andolan used. Some of them, such as Satyagraha, was actually an old repertoire that was used by Gandhi and other anti-colonial movements activists, mostly who were non-violent ones, during anti-colonial movements in India. So all these so we see there's a mix of different kinds of repertoires that are both old and new. We see repertoires that are used in a localized arena, whereas, which is different from repertoires that are used in regional arena or international arena. So we chart all those varieties of repertoires, the reasons that they have been used in certain contexts, the way that they have been deployed. For example, there are repertoires which are mundane repertoires, so repertoires which you can use every day. For example, dharna, which is sit-in. You can use dharna in many kinds of movements throughout the world. But then there are repertoires which are extreme repertoires, which such as Jal Samarpan, which is basically using a team of suicidal squad activists who can actually die for the movement by going into the water, submerging themselves into the water. So we see all kinds of repertoires, and all of them have different contexts of usages, different scales of usages, different political arenas of usages, different linguistic as well as historical context of usage as well. So I will kind of finish it here for now. I think it's about 10 minutes, and we can discuss other things later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arnab. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
I know Tiago has joined, so Tiago, we'll come to you all the way in the end. And what I'll request is that you quickly introduce yourself, and then you maybe present your chapter. So for now, then, like, to kind of just to keep the thread going, we'll go to Aurora and Stefania. And I hope it is okay that I'm addressing you by your first names. Yeah,
of course.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Sutapa. Do you mind if I share my screen? We put together a very short presentation, so I'll try.
Yeah.
You should enable me to share the screen, otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that right now.
Thank you.
All right, you should be able to share your screen now.
Yeah, okay, can you see it now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. All right, so Aurora and I wrote chapter 20 of the handbook, and what we were trying to do in this chapter was to present frame analysis as a technique in the context of social movement research. And I started in the first part by providing some introductions about the origin of frame analysis as a method, but also as a conceptual tool to try and understand social movements. And then Aurora does most of the chapter, because she takes you through the application of frame analysis in the context of a specific example of social movement. So she does the meaty part of the chapter, I have to say. So I'll just do the same we'll do the same in this presentation. I'll just provide some ideas in relation to frame analysis, and then Aurora will proceed with providing more about how to apply it. We thought it would be good to start with some ideas around frame. What do we mean by frame? Why it started to become important to think about frames in the context of social movement research. And we see a lot of the use of the word frame anyway, also in mundane conversations. So it can become a bit confusing when a researcher starts to think about using this technique, because it's very difficult to pin down what it is and how to develop it. In fact, we have very different applications of it. So to start very plainly, or start basic, we can think of a frame as a sort of way to interpret things. So a schemata of interpretation that helps us to understand, for instance, an event, an issue, or a situation. Or said in other ways, a story can be told in many different ways. So there might be many different frames through which a specific event can be represented. The idea comes from social cognition. Probably that's why it's slightly difficult to translate it into sociological research or social science research. So Bateson in social cognition introduced the idea of frame. And then this was borrowed by Goffman in his work on frame analysis, when we start seeing how we can try to use it as a conceptual tool, but also as a method to understand ways in which facts or events are being interpreted in different ways, can be interpreted in different ways. And then probably one of the first applications that became very relevant to social movements and protests more broadly was the idea of media frames. So basically research that was looking at how news outlets produce representation of protests and social movements in very specific ways. So by, for instance, giving more evidence to certain aspects of a protest event, like violence, or things that would attract attention more than others. So the idea of media frames, for instance, is very much used by Gittling himself, and the whole world is watching, where he was studying how different news outlets were producing representations of the Students for Democratic Society movements in the US in the 60s. But then if we move on to social movements research in more specific terms, we start seeing the concept of collective action frames. So basically here, we are looking at the way in which social movement actors themselves produce interpretation of what they do. So how they produce messages, how they produce interpretations of society that are central to what they want to do. And here, well, we put one of the examples of work that has put the foundation to use frame analysis in the context of social movement research to understand collective action frames. Now, when we think of these frames or these schemata of interpretation in the context of social movement actors, we need to think of different cultural elements. So the ideas, the values, the memories, the traditions, and the symbologies that become part of a social movement. And as researchers, when we want to try and study this cultural fabric, we need to address what is visible, what is material of it. And it's usually text. So texts that are out there that are produced by social movement actors, for instance, in their slogans, in their campaigns, in their visions, in their manifestos, or in the interviews, for instance, in the spoken discourse of activists, but also the visual that is used in the context of a social movement life, and in the protest, in the demonstration, and so on and so forth. So what we do when we try to apply frame analysis is to address this material content, these different types of text, and understand how these texts represent this cultural fabric that is part of a social movement. And usually when we apply the first point in the study of a collective action frame is to focus on how social movement actors define and construct problems in their text, in the text that they produce, how they suggest solutions to these problems in society, how they curate, how they craft and curate messages that propose solutions for these problems, and then how they produce motivations for other publics, for other people and publics to engage in their protests and in their messages. Yeah, Aurora, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, so when it comes to empirical analysis of collective action frame, we first start in the chapter by revising or briefly summarizing the main empirical approaches that have been developed to study collective action frames. These approaches are very varied in how they conceive of collective action frame, as much as in how they intend to look at collective action frames. We, however, focused on those approaches that mostly focus on written texts and that are developed within case study research. When considering written text, we also discussed how collective action frame have been mainly analyzed by considering the symbolic devices that are contained in those texts, meaning those parts of the text that deliver some diagnostic, prognostic, or motivational significance to the text itself. And by diagnostic, we mean the parts of the text in which collective actors articulate their understanding of common problems or attribute blame and responsibility for those problems. The prognostic parts concerns the solutions developed to address such problems, and the motivations, as Stefania already said, concern the cause for collective actions, the collective horizons, and the reasons why people should mobilize. Then we zoom in on frame semantic grammar, which is a specific approach to the analysis of collective action frame that was developed by Stefania herself in the early 2010s. And it's one of the approaches that examines collective action frames by looking at a specific type of symbolic devices contained in the text. And these symbolic devices concern how the clauses composing the text are structured in terms of subject, object, and subject, verb, and object. So what I did, Stefania, can you move to the next slide? Thank you. What I did in my PhD research and what we discuss as an example illustration in the chapter is an empirical application of the frame semantic grammar approach to the study of collective action frame. So first of all, I'll give you a bit of a background to my PhD research so as to briefly guide you through how frame semantic the frame semantic approach was developed. So first of all, in my PhD, I started from this literature review, this research puzzle stating that LGBTQIA plus organizations, so we mean organizations lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual, and other type of organizations. So all of the organizations that mobilize so as to advance the rights of LGBTQIA plus people and sexual minorities. So previous studies found that these organizations have been considered for years to be rather isolated from both other organizations and also other social movements, and not to engage in collaborations or alliances. However, since the early 2000s, we found some fragmented evidence, I would say, of local alliances that were defined as intersectional alliances taking place mostly at the local level. So starting from this review, the aim of my research was to examine how solidarity was practiced and framed in the context of social media platforms. And I did so by considering organizations based in Milan and Madrid and how they developed these digital practices and discourses throughout the last decade, so between 2011 and 2020. So to analyze framing processes, I firstly mapped all of the organizations that I identified as LGBTQIA+ in the two cities, and then I decided to consider their Facebook pages. Because I started from previous research arguing that Facebook, because of its specific characteristics and affordances, is one of the platforms in which collective actors are mostly able to articulate strategic framing processes. And then I focused on the posts in which these collective actors were promoting collective action events, because as Stefania was saying, events are one of the aspects of the cultural fabrics in which framing processes take place. So here, what we address in the chapter is one of the sub-questions of my PhD research, which concerned how LGBTQIA actors frame problems, solutions, and calls for actions on social media. And for the sake of clarity and illustration, in the chapter, we only focus on the year 2019. So the next slide, Stefania, thank you. As I was mentioning before, how the way I tried to look at frames was precisely by looking at how the sentences were structured in the manifestos of the collective action events that I collected. So I would firstly look at the subject-verb-object structure of the sentence, so as to identify whether the subject delivered a problem, a solution, or a motivation. And then I developed a qualitative content analysis so as to understand what issues were discussed in terms of problems, in terms of solutions, and in terms of motivations. And the reasons why I decided to go to develop a frame semantic grammar approach was precisely because this approach is rather structured, and since I wanted to compare over time and across different contexts, the possibility to look at frames by considering, let's say, the same symbolic devices as an entry point to look at these interpretative and significant processes was, let's say, in my opinion, an appropriate approach so as to make the comparison actually possible in methodological terms. However, the decision to both develop a frame analysis and to develop it through the frame semantic grammar approach entailed some methodological challenges that I had to reflect on from the start of the research process as much as through the whole research process. First of all, one of the issues that I had to think of was what data sources were the most appropriate ones to study collective action frames. We already said that most of the times, in most of the investigations, frames are considered and examined by looking at written texts. However, we're also aware that increasing research is looking at visual content. In the case of my research, I decided to focus on text, but I still consider that this could be, let's say, a future development. So as to see how solidarity is not only discussed and framed, but also represented. Then I had to consider which symbolic devices to take into account. And as I mentioned before, I decided to develop a frame semantic grammar approach precisely for the sake of comparison, to make my comparison both in longitudinal terms and in cross-sectional terms as methodologically thorough as possible. However, I found myself with a core question, a core challenge, which was the necessity to develop and apply the frame semantic grammar approach, which was initially developed with respect to the English language, to two Romance languages, which were Italian and Spanish, that have a very different clause structure with respect to English. So that required a lot of thinking. And the reason why I said this was the core of the methodological approach is precisely because frame semantic grammar was not applied, in very structural ways, but it still required a lot of thinking, a lot of memoing when doing the qualitative coding, so as to decide how to code the sentences and how to code the issues that were contained in the sentences. However, with respect, besides these challenges, there are still challenges that I think I'm still dealing with respect to the work that I'm developing right now. In the chapter, we argue that frame semantic grammar offer opportunities to explore both the semantic relations in movement manifestos, as in the case of my research, as much as the discursive alliances within and across social movement fields. And I think that's it. We thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, both of you. Should we move to the next presenter then, Clare Saunders?
Hi, everybody. I don't know how I'm going to follow those two presentations because I think I pulled the short straw in having what I think is a much less interesting chapter about using surveys to study people attending protests. We tried to make the chapter exciting and put a few, useful tips on how to do it well. The chapter, I should say first, is co-authored with Emily Rainsford, who's a senior research fellow at Newcastle University. She can't be here today because she's on maternity leave. She was my PhD student 2010 to 2014 and has been a long-term collaborator. So I realised how old I am now in that my PhD was completed in 2004. And in the first postdoc I did, it included a survey of a humongous demonstration. It was about 200,000 people in Edinburgh for Make Poverty History around the time of the G8, when it was held at Gleneagles, not far from Edinburgh. And we devised a sort of protest survey method where we interviewed a few people, and then the instructions were quite hilarious when you look back on it. It was like, close your eyes, spin around, and then count 10 people and interview the next person. And then we handed out some surveys, some survey booklets afterwards. And we realised that we made some mistakes that I'll talk about as I go through, in terms of trying to do a protest survey that's kind of systematic and doesn't have too many problems with interviewer bias and response rate bias. In 2009, we firmed up all of the protocols for now what I think is pretty much seen as the state of art in how to survey people on a protest. That's called the Caught in the Act of Protest project. The website's really easy to find, actually, and all of our details on how to do the method are available there at protestsurvey.eu. Perhaps when I finish talking, I'll pop the link in the chat. And then in 2015, I got a British Academy Skills Acquisition grant to learn how to do something called propensity score matching, in order to weight the data if necessary to approximate a random sample. So why would you do a survey? I mean, I don't think we can do the kinds of exciting things that have been talked about so far. So you can't really use a survey to understand an entire episode of contention. You can't really use a survey either to understand how movements use framing. But what you can use a survey for is to understand individuals' views of those things. You can understand individuals' characteristics, who is the population there, and you can understand their attitudes and their self-reported behaviours. Important to qualify behaviours as self-reported rather than actual ones, because sometimes it's really difficult to measure behaviours with a survey because people forget exactly what they did in what time period, and I can say a bit more about that shortly as well. So really, you'd use the survey to get a general impression of the people who are on a protest, what they think, who they are. And I suppose one of the nice things about a survey is that you can reach lots of individuals through it, and you can make some generalizations about the people on a demonstration. You can also kind of cross-tabulate across different characteristics, so you could see if people who identify as men and people who identify as women have different views on issues. Now, the thing about a survey is, first off, that it measures individuals, who individuals are, what their attitudes and what their self-reported behaviours are. It can't actually measure something about a movement as a whole. And your survey is also only ever going to be as good as your sample. So, you know, sort of classic example, many of us who teach will have seen some classic mistakes with surveys done by undergraduates, where they want to do a survey about whether it's a problem, whether people think that what's going on in Gaza is a problem. And they will then have a survey that they've done with 25 of their friends and then claim that they've done a public survey. Now, that's obviously a massive problem. So your sample matters, and your survey is also only ever as good as your questionnaire. And the questionnaire has to be designed really carefully so that it talks to existing themes and theories that are established around social movements, or if you're developing new theoretical ideas, some new and interesting questions, it must be piloted. My experience of doing questionnaires over the last 30 years or so is that I don't think I have ever created a perfect one. I always look at the data when it comes in and think, oh gosh, why did I ask it in that way? Or how did I end up with that typo there? But yes, it needs piloting carefully first to minimize those kinds of mistakes. So there is a lot of research on political participation that's drawn from standard established cross-national surveys. I'm thinking particularly of the World Values Survey or the European Values Survey. And they ask sort of general questions about participation in protests. So the World Values Survey, I believe, asks, have you ever participated in a lawful or peaceful demonstration? The European Social Survey, the ESS, asks, in the past 12 months, have you attended a public legal demonstration? So the issue here is that different question wordings, even a very small change in the question wording, can lead to very, very different results. Now, I think if somebody had asked me if I had ever attended a public legal demonstration, maybe it's a translation thing into English, I wouldn't actually be sure what that meant. A public legal demonstration makes it sound as if it's a demonstration about the judicial system, or something to do with something else. That, yeah, it doesn't necessarily sound like it's the same thing as a lawful or peaceful demonstration. So when you compare the trend lines from the World Values Survey, which asks the ever question and says lawful peaceful demonstration, to the European Values Survey that says in the past 12 months, have you attended a public legal demonstration? The results are very, very different. In the UK, we see around between 3 and 6% of people saying they participated in a legal public demonstration in the last 12 months, whereas more than half of the population in the UK have ever participated in a lawful peaceful demonstration. So the question wording is weird. One of the other things is, you know, the time span that's asked about. So have you ever counts the little lady who participated in a demonstration once when she was a teenager, and she's now 72. She gets counted year after year in the trend data, and it makes it look like a cumulatively increasing number of people participating in protests. Whereas if you ask the past 12 months question, the line seems a lot steadier. So I'm one of these people, I get a bee in my bonnet when, as I still often do, if you're going to write an article and I'm your reviewer, don't start it with protest is booming. I mean, there is lots of protest, but the claim that protest is booming is often based on that data about the past. Sorry, on that question, have you ever, rather than proper trend, which would look at year on year compared to the year before, compared to the year before. I hope that makes sense. I'm interested to know, actually, maybe in the discussion, people could tell me if the term legal public demonstration makes sense to you. I think it's a very strange expression. So the other problem with these established cross-national surveys is that they just ask the question, have you participated in a protest? What we don't know is how many times ever, or how many times in the last 12 months they've participated in a protest. The other thing we don't know is what the issue was that they participated in. And then there are potentially recall problems because the response to the questionnaire is taken outside of the context of their participation, which is why doing a survey at a protest where you can be with the protester and amongst the protesters is preferred, because you can ask much more nuanced questions and you're asking people questions in the context of their participation in around the same sort of time span as their participation is taking place. So, yeah, for that reason, Emily and I, we both think that protest surveys in context are a really good idea, which leads to the next dilemma of how do you do it? Do you do it face to face? Do you administer your questionnaire with a link to an online survey? Do you print out loads of booklets and have self-addressed envelopes for people to send them back? Well, there are advantages and disadvantages, so far as I can tell, of all of those approaches. Face-to-face has the benefit of high response rates. So in our experience, only around 1 in 10 people say no to being interviewed face-to-face at a protest. But of course, you can't ask that many questions because protests are noisy. You'd also struggle to ask questions to the person in the samba band playing the biggest and loudest drum. And yeah, you won't have very many answers because you have to be quick. And that's why postal and online surveys work better, because you can ask a lot more questions, but they have low response rates. My anecdotal evidence so far is that a printed booklet and a returned addressed, stamped and addressed envelope seems to get higher response rates than an online questionnaire. But it's a lot more expensive to print all the booklets and carry all the booklets. So what we have tended to do when we ask people to do self-completion questionnaires is to print a leaflet with a link to a URL that goes to a Qualtrics site. Now, one of the big problems with self-completion questionnaires is that there's a lot of response bias. The people who fill them in are more likely to be female. They're more likely to be politically interested. They're more likely to have engaged in a number of demonstrations in the past. So how do you overcome the dilemma of whether to do face-to-face or online. On the Caught in the Act of Protest project, we decided that the best thing to do was to combine them both so that you can avoid the interview selection bias and also check for response rate bias. So we've done this by developing a methodology where we would prepare 1,000 self-completion questionnaires. That could be a leaflet, or it could be a booklet, a leaflet with a URL, or it could be a booklet with a self-addressed, self-stamped, ready stamped envelope. And so 1 in every 5 of these self-completion interviews has with it a short face-to-face questionnaire that you ask on the spot. To avoid the interviewer selection bias, you use a pointer to randomly select somebody, and then the team survey from the front and the back. Now, the idea is that combining a very short face-to-face interview, which most people say yes to doing, with the online booklet or the online or self-completion survey that only between 15 and 40% of people respond to, allows us to work out who is and who isn't responding to the survey. So let's say we've prepared 1,000 leaflets or booklets. We need to make sure they're distributed as randomly throughout the crowd as possible. The first thing you do when you get there is you try to estimate the size of the crowd. That's not very easy to do. You do get an eye for it as time goes on, and you know you've got it just right if you run out of questionnaires to hand out at exactly the right moment, which is when your protest team at the front of the march and your protest team at the back of the march meet in the middle. You know you've got it perfect. So let's say that you've got 3,000, you estimate 3,000 people on the march. You're armed with 1,000 questionnaires. You will try to hand out a questionnaire to 1 in every 3 people, and you try to do that as randomly throughout the crowd as possible. And 1 in every 5 of those people that are handed a questionnaire are also asked a face-to-face interview that's then used as a way of helping us understand whether there's response rate bias. So we ask simple questions like, which gender do you identify with, and what's your age, how many demonstrations have you been to before, and that allows us to compare the two groups of people. Now, I made it sound really simple, but anybody who's been on a demonstration, seen a demonstration, or researched a demonstration will know that they are not always orderly. They're often noisy. Sometimes the police get in the way of things happening. Sometimes the protesters do unexpected and unanticipated things. One exciting story I have is when we surveyed the 2010 student protests against the tripling of student fees in the UK. The head of the march basically stopped outside the Conservative Party campaign headquarters, and they started a big fire, and they used a number of our surveys to get the fire going as kindling with their placards. So we had a particularly low response rate for that one. There were also some police barriers in the way that stopped the survey team moving through. Another one that was really difficult to negotiate was a trade union congress march that had an estimated 225,000 people in it. We couldn't even see where the start or the end was in order to work out where to best place the team to cover the whole demonstration. And I'm sure we didn't manage to randomly select people on that demonstration as well. So yeah, it can be really difficult to estimate the size of the crowd. Sometimes it's impossible to even see the whole crowd. Probably you would need to have a drone in the sky to really understand the size and shape. Other things that can go wrong, we did one time upset some protest organisers who didn't realise that we were going to be looking so formal and officious with our survey regime. We got into a tiny bit of trouble with the organisers of one of the demonstrations, and a really small protest team. Whoever's got lots of background noise, please. Lawrence, it's you. We've tried to survey small demonstrations that we thought were going to be bigger than they were, and when you do that, the research team becomes rather too conspicuous. We also very stupidly tried to survey a vigil, which is impossible because everybody is supposed to be quiet and you're supposed to be respectful. And sometimes, although we have pointers to identify the respondents for us, sometimes volunteers lose their pointers and then they just have to try and find their own interviewees and find their own people to hand out questionnaires to. And that might mean that some interviewer selection bias creeps in again. Okay, so what do we do if we do identify some bias? Minimally, we should admit that it exists and suggest that our results should be interpreted with caution. Maximally, we could think about weighting the survey data, and in the chapter we hopefully explain clearly how to weight survey data. What have we learned from doing protest surveys? And it's really nice to see Katrin here. Katrin's been involved in some protest surveying as well. We learn loads of things about the types of people who go on protests and about why they go on protests. We learn about their motivations. There have been papers published on the types of people that participate in movements that have old social movement type repertoires compared to new social movement ones. A paper I published with Maria Grasso, Emily Rainsford, Chris Roots. Oh, I'm sure I've missed out one of the co-authors. In 2012, we wrote a paper on differential protest participation, which compared novices to returners, repeaters and stalwarts so that we could get a much more graded interpretation of the types of people who participate in protest compared to those standard cross-national surveys that I talked about earlier, where we only know yes or no, did you participate in a protest? So you can be much more nuanced. Published stuff on gender differences amongst protesters, around the trust or distrust that protesters have for the political system. And something that's just come out recently is a report on who participated in Extinction Rebellion's Big One demonstration, and I'll pop the link for that in the chat. I think I've probably waffled on for a long time. It's always a danger when I don't pre-prepare what I'm going to say and just think and talk on the spot like this. Hopefully that was useful and interesting, and I'm happy to take questions. And I will pop the Caught in the Act of Protest link into the chat because there's lots of guidance on there on how we did it, and I'll just pop the link to the recent report on who participated in Extinction Rebellion's Big One demonstration in the chat as well. And thank you so much for having me along.
Okay, thank you, Claire. And Katrin, you are on, and maybe Anna will make you a co-host so you can share your screen.
Yeah, that would be lovely. If I can share the screen, I will try.
I think you should be able to do that right now.
Yeah.
Let me see
There.
if you probably see the screen then. Where there is a...
Yes, we can.
All right, excellent. So I'm really happy to talk after Claire, because when she started about this kind of protest survey, or let's say there's regular surveys that have these very strange questions about participation, that was the reason why I started to study the movement outcomes. So that was a kind of, I was so fed up that we don't know anything about, or we can't know much about the protest activists, because there is usually like 5% of the population who says that they've done that. And I thought, why not study something else? So I'm going to look at what happens afterwards. And really, that's what I've done since then. And that was a long time ago. So I'm going to talk about what I wrote in a chapter, and that's research methods for studying collective action outcomes. So now I was expecting that we have had all the methods before. So kind of that I can say that, you know, you can use everything that other people have told you to study the outcomes. Now I can say that you can use everything that's been before and what Tiago will tell you about protest events to study the outcomes, because I'm not going into so much in the methods as such, but maybe a bit more in a kind of thinking what to do when you are interested in what comes after the mobilization. So in a chapter, I kind of talk about 3 challenges that are there or if you study, if you're interested in looking for the collective action outcomes. And I really emphasize that it's kind of important to think in terms of collective action outcomes, not just in terms of movement outcomes or just protest outcomes, because it is, we come back to that as well, but it really matters how you define your research object. And particularly because we're really interested here in different kind of causal relationships. But I would start, and not from the movement, but usually toward this a collective action of interest, but I would start from the, what sometimes you would call a dependent variable, or the outcome of interest. So we all know that often the activists themselves, but maybe even more the outsiders and scholars, but maybe even more the journalists are interested in this question of, oh, there was some kind of successful mobilization, whether the protest was failed or successful. And I would kind of advise not to go into that hole and thinking in terms of success and failure, because it's, yes, it's 0 and 1, but it's not so much of that, but it's also the fact that it's really hard to say when something is successful, because it could, every protest wave, any kind of collective action could have both. It can gain something, but it actually might mean also some kind of losses. And there is this really nice book by James Jasper, Gains and Losses, which came out recently, which also is cited in the chapter. So it would be reasonable to think in terms of what the collective action could gain, but also what it might lead some kind of losses in terms of what people lose, either personally or politically. We count that. Another thing is that if we focus only on this kind of success failure, then we miss the fact that there might be some unintended effects of the collective action. And while we usually think in terms of studying the outcomes, then you focus on the goal attainment. So did the movement, if you focus on the movement, but did the collective action, any kind, let's say the protest waves regarding the climate change, did they achieve their goal? Yeah, it's very hard to measure. We come back to that as well. But the idea is to relate that to the goal, what they had, what kind of claims they had. So we can use the claim analysis and frame analysis, figure out what goals they had in order to then relate that to the outcome. But sometimes it also might be something unintended. And there might be effects that we didn't know about, the movement didn't want to. And that's also something it's important to be open for. Another aspect is, of course, that the scholar is measuring or interested in some kind of effects that we look at, but that there are also reasons to study what the activists themselves perceive as an outcome of their collective action. Again, it's a different thing. You can use the protest surveys. Maybe if you have a repeated events, maybe that's something to do. But you also can look at the long-term mobilization then and really figure out how the activists themselves perceive this result of their mobilization. So there are many different aspects to think about when you're interested in this particular topic as a social movement outcomes or collective action outcomes. Before one makes a study, it's obviously important also to figure out what kind of change you look at, because in general we think about, okay, collective action leads to social change. The activists sometimes require the change in one specific policy. In my own research, what I've looked at is that they require no change, because when I've looked, for example, the local protest against school closures, then activists just don't want, they want to have a status quo. They don't want to have change. They don't want to have a school to be closed or the company privatized. And that's often related to these kind of political issues, what the politicians decide. But we have also many different other possibilities of changes. And again, in the chapter, you will find good references of these studies. But it's really important to define, again, in the beginning, what kind of change you're going to look at. Because depending on that, you will need to have specific materials and data to use. So when we have now decided, let's say we are interested in maybe political change, I'll talk more of that because that's what I've done in my own research, it's easier for me to talk about that. Then you need to focus on, of course, the other part. So you have your dependent variable, you're interested, let's say, in political change. You know that you're going to focus political legislations, for example. Now, how to relate that to the collective actions? And if you're interested in, let's say, environmental politics, then you would go and think about environmental movements. And it's not only one environmental movement. If you're interested in a country, then you need to think about general collective action related to this particular topic. So here it is, this connection between the outcome of interest in terms of what kind of policy change or social change, and then also what kind of actions. We usually, as a social movement scholars, we don't care much about lobbying, but I would say that if one is interested in policy change, that's actually something to really combine and think about, and not to forget that there is also the lobbying activities that some of the social movement organizations use, but obviously you also have the big corporations that might work against the movement. So one shouldn't just take the movement activities of collective action in terms of the outside this process. One has to consider all of them. And there are loads of different actions that then you can measure them, obviously, via, for example, the protest event analysis that Tiago will tell you more about later on. But one can also focus on some other ways of collecting data, not only kind of protest event analysis. What I would suggest not to do, which maybe was more common previously when we didn't have a good data, is just to rely on the membership rates of organizations, because that really doesn't give you the good idea what the movement actually is doing, or doesn't give you the sense of real collective action. But it has been used as a proxy in studies when we didn't have maybe the good data on protest events. But I personally wouldn't go for that. But then the major thing, as I said, is really to relate your collective action and their claims, what they make. So really going and using this frame analysis, seeing what they say, what they demand with your particular change of interest, so that you don't lump together all the protests related to the environment to, let's say, the change in wind energy policy. Because there might be the protests for and against. We know the environmental activists are actually protesting both in favor and against. And so if you're interested in this kind of policy change, then you really need to take care of what kind of actions you look at. Now, if you're interested in a movement outcome, then of course one would have a long-term perspective, and maybe then it's not particularly just counting the protest of actions, but then you have a more qualitative idea of relating these different mobilization waves and tracking the changes of ideas more carefully, more qualitatively. And that's again another way of doing that. So studying the collective action outcomes doesn't mean that you have to do really a quantitative study only. You can do really nicely the process tracing analysis as well. But I would say that most of the recent studies, now I haven't, in the article, I don't present really the meta-analysis, but the ones that I have done before, you can really see that there have been more use of quantitative methods, maybe also because it's easier to generalize. All right, so let's say that we have defined now the dependent variable and independent variable, if we go for this kind of methodological jargon, or we just interested in the social change, we have defined that, and the actions. But the major problem for the scholar interested in this particular collective outcomes is really how to establish this. Like, how do we know that there is this particular movement, how much influence it really has, and their collective action? How do we relate that to change of interest? And how we account for other factors? Because there are many other factors that influence, let's say, political change or economic change. But even if you're interested in the biographical outcomes, like how the participation in different kind of protest influences people, either bystanders or activists themselves, It doesn't really have to be only the participation in collective action, could be many different factors. And that's a major challenge here. This kind of other factors, we have to like confounding variables, which are in method courses probably heard. So what helps here is that, yeah, we can find correlations between protest events and changes in, let's say, policies. And that's correlation. We find actually very weak correlation. It's very rarely you find nice, strong correlation between those events. But sometimes you might find. It's important to recall that the correlation is not causality. And there, what you can help, like we can help, is obviously theory. And I wouldn't kind of stop emphasizing that the good theory is half of the study here. Is not like any good, whatever method you're going to use, it doesn't compensate for the lack of theory. But the other way is to really think in terms of the confounding variables and what things we can study. And I made a small graph here. What do we mean here? So let's say that my picture disappeared. Now you see there. Okay, now you have all of them here. So mainly we're interested in the aspect of collective action related to some kind of change. So this is a horizontal line, what you see. But it might be this collective action leads to some kind of media coverage, or might be some kind of political crisis, and that leads to change of interest, some kind of change in a legislation or whatever different kind of change you look at. But it could also be, and if you look at those red arrows, that is something actually totally different in collective action that leads to both the collective action waves and the political change or economic change or whatever change you're interested in. So this is a kind of important that we don't count this effect of collective or relationship between collective action and change of interest as is spurious, but maybe there is no relationship whatsoever. But we see the correlation because we have missed to account for those external factors. And that I would really emphasize that it's easier to do with the quantitative studies, but you can also do that obviously with different methods of analysis, and process tracing will also help you here. But that is a kind of the goal to establish really a nice causal relationship when we looked at. And I actually stop here. I have this one picture more, which is not maybe picture, but the really emphasis that it's the method and design doesn't help us because in terms of the thinking of how your collective action relates to the outcomes, the theoretical idea how it should be related. What are the stages which kind of changes take place there between? That's really the core here. And what kind of methods you use to measure both the outcome variable, the change, or the protest events or collective action. It's important, obviously, but I would say that there you can play so much with these factors. But if you don't have the reasoning behind how they should be related, then unfortunately you might fail. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katrin. Tiago, sorry, we started before you joined. So just to kind of stay on time. If we can have Tiago do a very quick introduction of himself and then start the presentation. And then in Q&A, we can take questions, like maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then kind of refer back to all those who presented in this session. Yeah. So
Sure.
Tiago, you're on. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just share the screen. I'll do brief presentation of what I've done actually in this chapter actually. And first of all, I'm sorry for being late, but I was marking essays yesterday. I saw the time and I thought it was at 6, not at 5, and then I decided at 5 to check, is it at 5 or 6, and then I realized that I was late. So I'm sorry for that, and thank you so much again for inviting me to write this chapter. It was great because I had the chance to go over all the research that I've done. And so I'm Tiago. I'm a researcher at the University Institute of Lisbon, and I've done my PhD on anti-austerity mobilizations in Portugal and Spain. That came out recently as a book, or actually 2 years ago. And I actually use a protest event analysis. That's the first time I use the protest event analysis, and that's a method that I've been using in the past few years in other research projects as well. So I'd like to greet the room and the colleagues here, and thank you. And sorry, Katrin, for not having presented the protest event analysis before you. But so thinking about, so the title I gave to the chapter was Analyzing Protest Events, a Quantitative and Systematic Approach, because the protest event analysis in itself is a method that I was actually created within social movement studies, and it's sort of the cornerstone of the discipline. I don't want to exaggerate, but authors like Thiele and Taro and so on have used it since the 1960s, 1970s. So it's pretty much, there are a lot of, and I say that in my own chapter, there are a lot of work done on how to do protest event analysis, and this is just a contribution and reflection of my own. So here I bring not my own research, but the research done by David Bailey from the University of Birmingham, where he actually shows us how protests evolved in the UK in the 2010s. And so I just wanted to show this first image for those who don't have an idea of what the protest event analysis is, to see what it can look like. All right. So here basically we have what we could call the actors or the players, or the group of actors and players that protested throughout this time. And here you have the type of repertoires or protest action that they use. Okay, so we can see how it evolved and if there are innovations, so to say, throughout this decade. So now that we have an idea, so I wrote chapter 19, Analyzing Protest Events, a Quantitative and Systematic Approach, and this is how it's organized with the sections and subsections. But what I wanted to do was basically also to identify what is new, because as many authors say, the protest event analysis is not a method that was created and then stopped in time. Actually, with new developments in terms of technology, mainly computational social sciences and so on, there have been some developments that we have to thank. And that helped to develop the protest event analysis in terms of automating the process of data collection and coding, for instance, but also in terms of what are our data sources. Okay, so if before our data sources were mainly newspapers, what and Peter Creasy and other authors call a negative choice because it's the more available source of data that we can find. Today we also have, as I'll show you in the end, some data. We have data that we can collect, and it is produced by the actors themselves on social media and so on. So we can also pay attention to that. So I go through and how did I come to use the protest event analysis, defining it, giving some more technical instructions in terms of the sources, the sampling and unit of analysis, and specifically thinking about doing comparative work, since that's how I started, and what it brought. Then the difficulties about doing a protest event analysis, namely its labor intensiveness, the selectivity and the bias, and latency, and visibility that normally the protest event analysis does not cover. And then some of the new developments. But so here I don't want to go through some of the technicalities. I want to more define it and then talk about what is new, what we can think about in the future in terms of using the protest event analysis and the event analysis family of that has been developing social movement studies, and to think in a more creative way about how can we use these tools in our own research and adapt it to our own research if we have new questions. So to put it simply, Sven Hutter actually defines it really well, and it's a type of quantitative content analysis that we use to turn words into numbers and to understand how protests vary with the changing environment. So as we could see, we had this type of quantification of events throughout time and to understand how it varies, all right? So what it allows you is to understand these ebbs and flows of protests and the dynamics and protest properties of a protest cycle. And so to understand throughout time, who are the organizers, what types of claims do they have, the repertoire, when does the protest happens, and where do the protest happens. And so even though there is selectivity and bias, the fact that you go through a source, normally a newspaper, classically a newspaper, that means that you go through a specific source every single day, or depending on how you sample, 1 day a week or 3 days a week, but you go through it in a systematic manner that helps you to build this quantitative data set. Nevertheless, it's important to mention, and I tell this story in the chapter from my own experience, that even though this is a quantitative method, we should also have a qualitative eye to it. Because in my own experience, because I've combined during my PhD research, I've combined the quantitative part with interviews to understand what I call the backstage of the mobilizations and how actors organized. So I could understand a bit better what are the faces and characteristics and features of the mobilization process, but also in reading the news itself and not only quantifying it, I was able to find, for instance, what I called labor from below in Spain, where there were a lot of labor strikes not connected to a particular trade union federation, but rather they were organized autonomously, but they were not linked, but they were more a repertoire that emerged. So I thought, and I could only identify that if I read the newspaper pieces and start to identify this pattern. So I talk about 3 limitations and 3 developments. I'll talk more briefly here about 2 limitations and 2 developments and how they relate with each other. The first of all, you have to take in consideration that this is an exhausting type of work. It's very labor intensive. I think to build the data sets, if I'm not wrong, if I remember correctly, between other tasks that I did during my PhD, but to build a data set from Portugal and Spain, 2009, 2015, it took me about 2 years, 2 years and a half, because I had to collect and code and go through all of that process. But today there are other tools to collect the data and to code it. There are ways to collect data automatically through code from digital platforms and to automatically code it. So it's easier to do that. Nevertheless, a recent paper points out that actually that brings another issue, that you have to know how to code. You have to have different skills from just collecting pieces from newspapers. A second critique that is very much pointed at this type of technique or method comes from new social movements, if you want, that point out that protest event analysis normally doesn't allow us to see what happens in periods of where there isn't so much activity of social movements. And so, namely Melucci and so on, and other authors. So what happens in social movements when you don't see protest? And this technique only captures protest. So maybe we need to look and find other tools to look at that and to quantify that. And so me and with Guia Cornero in the project that we had, that Guia was the PI and then I was hired as a postdoc, we developed this new approach, which we call the engagement event analysis. And so this is a table that I did for the chapter. I tried to understand the family of event analysis, considering, first of all, the type of actions, if it only included protests, or could include other types of events that were not only protests, and the types of actors, if they were non-institution, but could also include institutional actors. And I mapped it in this way. I know it can be contentious, but I thought it would be a good idea to try to map it and say, well, there's more than just a protest event analysis when it comes to analyzing events in social movement studies. And so we thought about this engagement event analysis, which is a sort which we basically went to, in the housing movement in Lisbon, we mapped the main groups, we went to their Facebook page, we used this idea of automating and digitalizing the data collection, and we scraped the data from their social media pages, and then we coded manually because it was not yet, we didn't know exactly how to do it yet in that way, and it was not possible. So just to show you that, this is from my PhD dissertation, I'll pass because I don't want to run out of time, but just to give you an example of what this resulted. Actually, when we measured, we distinguish between known protests and protest activities in this time period between 2012 and 2020. Actually, what we see is that protest is only 18% of the overall activities that the housing movement does in Lisbon. And there's a lot of other types of activities, such as organizing assemblies, parties, organizing debates, meeting with institutions, and so on and so forth. So this helped us to, go a bit beyond these ideas of limitations and developments, even if it has problems. Here is from a paper that we wrote, published in Housing Studies, where we can see the offline housing events and where they happen in the city of Lisbon. And finally, the types of actions that they do. So what I'm trying to say here is that if we are creative with the methods, with this particular family of methods in social movement studies, the event analysis, we can also go a bit beyond the difficulties that the protest event analysis had initially, because there are a lot of new tools available for us. And so we can go a bit beyond that. And so I'll finish here, and thank you so much again.
Thank you. Should we open it to Q&A? We have some time. If anybody has any questions, even amongst those who presented right now, if you have any questions for each other or those who have joined us, I can either drop the question in the chat box or maybe just raise your hand and ask, or just ask maybe. Do we have any questions? No? I have a question, though. I have a question for Aurora and Stefania, if it is okay for me to ask. Maybe I'll ask, and maybe then there will be some other people who will be popping up with some of the questions they have. or when Aurora was presenting, you had mentioned about qualitative content analysis. And I was kind of wondering, when you do the content analysis, do you do it manually, or do you use any software to do the content analysis? How is it done? And either way, like, what are the pros and cons if you are doing it manually versus using a software, or if there is a software to do it?
Thanks for the question, Stefania. Is it okay if I reply? So all of that was done manually. Both the frame semantic grammar approach, the frame semantic grammar, and the qualitative content analysis through the help of MaxQDA. So I still coded like all of the texts, and it was a lot of text. I think it was in total like 6,000 collective action events. And so I simultaneously, firstly, coded the clauses according to their diagnostic, prognostic, or motivational framing. And then I looked at the issues that were discussed in the framing. So I had like these let's say two-level code book that was developed in MaxQDA. The first one with respect to the frame semantic grammar, so what the clause, would look like. And then the second level with respect to the issues discussed. And I basically, to develop the code book, I implemented like this hybrid approach in which I started from a deductive code book that I created based on previous studies. And then I did a pilot test on a random sample of the events stratified by year, so as to see whether new codes would emerge. And then I tested it, and then I checked for to see whether I was consistent in how I was coding. And once the pilot test was done, I started with the coding of the whole corpus of text.
And is there any software to do that as well? Like, if you don't want to do it manually? Just kind of out of curiosity. I don't do frame analysis, but I found it very interesting. I do narrative analysis, and narratives can also be done manually, and there are different softwares, and I never used a software just because I didn't want to.
So I'm not an expert in automated content analysis. I know there are some people within like the computational social sciences trying to create algorithms to do automated frame semantic grammar. And I think they also contacted us a couple of years ago.
So if you look at the frame semantic grammar, the structure of it is a grammar. So people have been getting in touch with me to see whether they wanted to design an algorithm to try and identify. It is based on the grammar of the sentence anyway, so there could be automated way to do it, computational ways to do it. So people have been trying to do it, and I'm sure it is possible. But I don't know if out there is already a tool doing it now.
I don't think there is, and I also think that it could be a bit problematic because not all of the languages are structured in the same ways. So either these algorithms have develop a specific dictionaries that are different per each language. Otherwise, we would miss some information that is very relevant when looking at the diagnostic, prognostic, or motivational delivery.
Yeah. Thank you. Do we have any questions, like those who have, or amongst yourselves, if you have any questions? I don't know. I found it very interesting. Like the entire day has been interesting. There's so much to learn. So very thankful to all the presenters. If there aren't any questions, then maybe we can pause here. Thank you again for joining us and for also contributing to the book. we wouldn't have had a book without you. So it was like a great, I mean, like we enjoyed the process thoroughly and also enjoying the entire day today. So I just want to mention this, that we'll have a half-hour break, like 30 minutes break, and then we'll reconvene at 18 hours UTC time. So, and the next session would be session 5, and it would be on indigenous and global movements research. So thank you again to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.